and welcome to Whose Woods These Are, a festival of trees. I'm Natalia and this is Eimear.
Hello.
This festival grew out of a project Eimear and I started working on in 2019 called the Whose Woods These Are project.
The original intention of the project was to compose music that we would perform in woodland settings for the audience. But of course this hasn't been possible in 2020, so instead we invite you all to enjoy the woodlands here from the comfort of your own home.
There's lots of ways you can join us during the festival. You can head over to the Doc's website, thedoc.ie, and you can go to our Leaf Lounge there. The Leaf Lounge has creative encounters with nature that you can go and do outside. It's got a kids zone with films and workshop activities, and it's got some recipes for some mocktails, and that's over at thedoc.ie.
Also, at any time during the festival, you can join our friends over at stillvoicesfilmfestival.com for a free screening of Call of the Forest.
And then, of course, you can also join us here on Tree TV. So Tree TV is going to run Thursday through Sunday this week from 8 o'clock. And it's about 2 hours. It's a mix of music and performances, lectures, and we even have an arboreal arts and reading group, all sorts of things, all about, yeah, you guessed it,
trees. We'd like to thank all our wonderful performers and speakers and contributors for sharing their enthusiasm and their inspiration and their beautiful work on trees with us for this festival.
Yeah. And we'd like to say a huge thank you to everyone at the Doc Arts Centre who's worked so hard with us on this. We're all new at the online festival thing. Big thank you to Caroline for the filming. Huge thank you to Ray, Paul, Kira, Liz, Laura at the Doc, and especially to Sarah, the director at the Doc, who the festival was, it's kind of her idea to have a festival of trees. Big thank you to Roshan and Willie, who've done a lot of work for us on this. And thank you all for coming. There's so much more we could have said about trees and so much wonderful things that people all around the world have to say about trees. We couldn't fit it all in. But, yeah.
So now we invite you to just sit back, relax, and enjoy the very, very first episode of Tree TV.
Tree!
In the beginning was a seed, and in that seed was a tree. Sing awake, arise, begin the growing you will need, till one day you're a seed again.
I've had a banana this morning, so I've got the strength. Do you know when we made all the smoke and the dust before? It's like we want all the dust to drop down into this little chamber. And the idea is that like it builds up enough heat in there through the friction that the dust ignites and we create a little coal in the center. And lots of mythologies around the world. They say that fire is hidden inside the plants and the trees, and you have to coax it out by rubbing the sticks together. So I'll try some coaxing. Get my little tinder bundle ready. So this is the bark, the inner bark from the lime tree or the linden tree. You make a tight little nest with it, just like a bird. And we put in some dry fluffy seeds and a little bit of a mushroom just to grow the ember in case it's very small. Yeah, so already it's 3 different types of tree. Or, yeah, 3. So we've got the linden for the board, the hazel for the spindle and the bow, the linden bark for the nest, and the birch bark, which is super flammable. Okay, give it a go. Not yet. hands stop shaking. I'm on fire. So I'm going to show you how to transform acorns, so the seeds from the oak tree, into food and drink and medicine. So the acorns start to fall usually at the end of October. This year in particular was an amazing year. It's called a mast year. So a mast year for any tree means that that tree will produce loads of seeds or loads of nuts at once. And so creating like a feast year for all of the animals, and then the next year there might be a famine year. So it's like this kind of balance that nature is playing in the world around us. So it was a mast year for the oak trees, and the amazing thing about that for me is it's never just one oak tree. It's like all the oak trees on this land were dropping huge amounts of acorns this year. So it was a great year for acorns, so I've really filled my stores. So yeah, gathering them from the ground when they're brown, making sure that there's no damage on them, so you don't want to find any that have like little holes from weevils in them, because if you put that into all of your acorns, then the weevil can just travel through all of the acorns and ruin your whole store. So yep, checking them for any kind of blemishes, any little holes. And then storing them. So you want to dry them, and you can dry them with the shell on. It's important when you dry them that they're not touching one another. So sometimes I'll put them in the dehydrator, or I'll put them on like a willow tray somewhere warm, and I just make sure that they're not touching each other. If they're touching each other, the moisture can build up and they'll start to mold. So depending on how warm it is, this can take anywhere from like a week to a month. And then when they're completely dried, you can store them and use them all the time later on in the year. Or you can just shell them straight away when you get them. So to shell them, they shell easier when they're dried. When they're fresh, they're really, really hard to peel. But when they dry, the nut inside shrinks. So it's a lot easier to get them out. So just put them into a pestle and mortar, give them a crack, and you have this beautiful creamy nut inside. So you do that with a bunch of friends until you have a huge big bowl or bucket or whatever of this, and then you're ready to move on to the next step. So the next stage now, after you have dried and shelled your acorns, is that you want to get off this little papery layer around the outside. But if it's getting to the stage where those little papery layers don't come off that easily, you can dry them again and it will come off. So you can see there, they're coming off a little bit. So the papery layers are going to be a lot more bitter, And when we move on to this step of leaching out the tannins from the acorns to make them edible, that will act as a barrier for the tannins leaching out. So you want to get those off as much as possible. One way that I will do this is to completely dry the acorns again. And you can see that it's just really easy, like the little papery sheaths just kind of come off. I have a friend who does this with their hairdryer, which is a good technique as well. So you want to get all those little papery bits off. And then you're ready to move on to this next step, which is known as leaching. So the oak tree and acorns are full of something called tannins. So tannins are a chemical that's present in trees, and the reason the tree has these is to protect itself from predators. So they'll release tannins, which are very bitter, astringent taste, and that will be a deterrent to any kind of predator that tries to eat the tree. So there's loads of studies done about this, where some trees will have tannins, and if there's a grazing animal coming along, that they'll release pheromones to warn trees further away so that they release more tannins in preparation for this animal arriving. So tannins are incredible, and they're what are used, why oak was such an important tree for tanning leather. So this would be vegetable tanned or bark tanned, and that is the tannins from the tree, from the acorn shells, from the sweet chestnut shells. There's lots of different trees that have a lot of different tannins in them. And when we're tanning, we often witness that different characteristics of trees will be present in the different types of leathers. So an oak barked one is really strong, really sturdy. It's great for making belts and shoes, whereas the willow barked is much softer. Tannins are also really important medicine for us. So that act of being really astringent, really drying in our body, what that does is it tightens up any excess liquid in the body. So they're used a lot as gargles for sore throats, or if there's any bleeding in the body or excess liquid in the form of vomiting or diarrhea. So incredible medicines as well for us and for other animals too. But we don't want to eat them, because they're very bitter. So if we want to make an acorn flour, we want it to be lovely and nutty and sweet. We don't want that really drying bitter taste in our breads or in our however we decide to use the acorns. So there are two methods of leaching. So there's hot leaching or cold leaching. So hot leaching would involve boiling the acorns in boiling water and changing the water maybe up to 5 or 6 times. You can just keep tasting them as you go, and when you feel that they're sweet enough, that they're nutty enough, then that's okay. Then cold leaching is just draining the acorns through cold water. So either you can do this by, it's always quite good to grind the acorns at this stage so that you have more surface area for the tannins to leach out, and you're just kind of like the hot water but with cold water, constantly flushing out cold water. In the past, people would have buried acorns and poured cold water into the pit so that the tannins would constantly leach out, or put a mesh bag in the river, and then or in a small stream, and the water flushes through the acorns. Obviously, you want to be sure of the cleanliness of the water before you do that. But one way that you can just do this in your kitchen is to crush the acorns, put them in a jar, fill the jar with water, and you'll see the colour change in the water. The water will turn a dark brown, and then as you keep changing the water over the course of say a week, you'll notice that the water becomes clearer and clearer each time as the tannins leach out and are washed away. So there's advantages and disadvantages of both hot leaching and cold leaching. What hot leaching will do, if you leach the acorns in boiling water, is that they will take out the starch from the acorns. So it means that if you want to bake breads or cakes, that you'll need to add in extra starch, whether that's in shop bought starch, or if you get cattail roots or other plants that are roots that are rich in starch in nature. So that would be But you can still make things from the hot leached acorns. So you can still make like this coffee substitute, you can make hummus, you can make pancakes, you can make little flatbreads that we're going to make today. So there's still loads of different ways that you can use those acorns. So these are some hot leached acorns. They've been boiled about 5 times, and then I've crushed them again. And now, because they got a little bit wet in the rain, they were really dry before, I'm going to put them onto the pan here. And when we put them onto the pan, it's just going to like toast it, so it gives it a really nice toasted flavour. And it's also just going to remove any of that excess water that's left in them, so that when we do go to crush them, whether that's in a pestle and mortar or in a NutriBullet or a food processor, that it'll blitz up into a really fine powder really quickly. This is where NutriBullets come in really handy. And mortar. So now I have my acorn flour, and there's still quite a few bits in it. I would probably sieve those out and dry them and powder them again, but such as it is, we're going to keep going and just have some crunchy bits. You know, acorn flour, it takes loads of work to go from the tree growing it to you gathering it to you like shelling it and grinding it and drying it and grinding it. You mightn't get loads of flour, so it's okay to add other flour in there. So you could just add regular flour, self-raising flour. This is sweet chestnut flour. So yeah, you can mix a little bit just to bulk it all out and mix that in. And I'm just going to make like a really simple flat cake with this that we're going to roast on the pan and have with some delicious birch syrup. I'm going to get pretty messy now. Add the water in. More flour. And we're going to bring this over and roast it on the pan. Have a little bit of acorn coffee to go with my bread. So this is birch syrup. So in the springtime, when the sap is rising, you can tap the birch trees for the water. And kind of like maple trees, you can boil that water down to create a syrup. But unlike maple trees, it doesn't yield as much syrup. So it's like 1 litre of birch water will create like 1 milliliter of syrup. So this is very precious stuff. So we're going to enjoy this. A precious syrup for a precious acorn cake with a precious little bit of acorn coffee. Tastes like trees. Yum.
Hello there, I'm Marion McGarry and I'm delighted to be giving this talk today for the Whose Woods These Are Festival 2020. My talk today is going to be on trees in Ireland, history, meaning and identity. So this talk is going to explore the spiritual and sacred significance of trees to the ancient Irish, from prehistory until the timber famine in the 17th century, and then right up to the modern day. Trees from ancient times to present in Ireland will be discussed here in the time allowed, of course. I'll be looking at holy trees, sacred sites, and the folkloric significance of some tree types. I'll briefly look at the connection of trees to Ogham, poetry, and the protection of trees under the Brehon laws. And I'll also be looking at the connection of trees to chieftains and clans. Specifically, I'm going to look at forests as a place of refuge for Irish rebels in the 16th and 17th centuries. And then I'll talk about how the dramatic effects of the so-called timber famine in the 17th century and the loss of craft and forestry skills happened as well. So from that point onwards, it marked a time from which that ancient connection to trees in Ireland and the association of native Irish people with forests was gradually lost. I'll also look at the whole barrenness of the countryside in the 18th and 19th centuries as a spiritual metaphor for continued colonisation. I'll then conclude with a look at Irish forestry and timber production today, very briefly, before moving on to the work and a particular project that I was involved with my colleagues in GMIT Letterfrack of late, which resulted in the book See the Wood from the Trees. And it's hoped that this talk will highlight Ireland's once connectedness to trees and the significance of trees to Irish identity in order to show how trees might be reclaimed as a marker for Irishness, perhaps in the future. So to begin, ancient woodlands. Trees are embedded in the very history of Ireland and ancient Irish identity, but we may not be aware of it. Ireland today has, depressingly, the lowest forestry cover of any European country, Western European country, and this has been the case going back for about 300 years. Our lack of trees in Ireland has only been a recent occurrence in the context of our natural history. Ireland today is characterised by the familiar patchwork of green fields and hedgerows, Midlands bog and wildness of the Atlantic coast. But the country has only had this appearance for a relatively short period in its natural history. Prior to the 17th century, Ireland largely enjoyed a blanket of vast deciduous forests. Even the areas we know as distinctively barren and treeless today, such as Connemara, would have had woodland. To the ancient Irish, trees were of great importance and had deep spiritual significance. The first settlers to Ireland around 10,000 years ago would have encountered a thickly wooded land of juniper, pine, oak, yew and elm. It was an arboreal wonderland utterly dominated by trees. The land was populated with all manner of wildlife too, including threats such as bears and wolves. Because of the profusion of forests, ancient people often found it easier and safer at times to navigate via the rivers and waterways, often using boats which were dug out and made from large trees themselves. People utilised the woodland and human numbers were small. The early settlers, nomadic hunter-gatherers, made little impact on the forests in terms of clearances. But this started to change with the introduction of agriculture around 6,000 years ago, which marked the slow beginning of land clearances for farming. It is known that the pagan religions that were practiced by the first farmers featured tree worship. Druids were known to have used sacred groves to conduct some ceremonies, which made some trees symbolically important. Timber from particular species was regarded as sacred, for example, yew. Early Christians then adopted the pagan sacred sites, marked as they were with holy trees, and the tradition continued in a modified form. Gaelic kings and Brehon laws prioritised tree protection. Many trees were seen as holy, curative, important. They offered shelter, and above all, they were useful. And obviously, their uses included building, furniture, firewood, transport and shelter. To the early pagan farmers, trees were large, lived longer lives than humans, and were strong and useful. Furthermore, their roots went deep underground, believed to be the otherworld, and their branches soared high into the skies. The ancient Irish were close to the natural world, and the Druids believed trees embodied spirits and were a source of wisdom. It is no surprise that the early Irish venerated trees, as did the wider Celtic world. Trees, as providers of shelter and protection, and with their connectedness to the earth, became associated with the community. The life and health of the trees represented the power and symbolic protection of the local chieftain and his people. In Ireland, the emphasis seems to have been more on individual trees than on particular sacred groves, as might have been the case in the rest of Europe. There was such a profusion of forests in Ireland that the term Gaelic is, according to the author John T. Cock in 2004, he suggested that the term may have come from forest people, wild men, or later warriors. The belief in sacred trees in general was innate in Gaelic society. In the early texts, these sacred trees were often referred to as billa and were frequently associated with Irish royal inauguration sites. A sacred tree was often a feature to be found adjacent to a royal residence or fort, or marked an important holy or curative place, and this practice continues in Ireland today at holy wells. That trees were significant to Gaelic feudal classes who would have patronised the arts is demonstrated in the influence in early Irish poetry and the development of the Ogham alphabet. Poetry from that time is noted for its vivid description of nature and demonstrated how trees were a common frame of reference, that tree types were widely recognised and familiar, and the very existence of trees was celebrated. The significance of trees in ancient Ireland is also shown in the links between trees and the development of the Ogham alphabet or Ogham alphabet. Ogham was the first form of script ever used in the Irish language, and the alphabet consists of a series of marks and nicks arranged along a line. It is believed by many that Ogham is a tree alphabet, and some letters are named after different native Irish trees. This connection again underlines how valuable and significant trees were once considered in Ireland in ancient times. As many chieftains and clans had individual or groups of sacred trees in their locales, which functioned as signifiers of their power, this made the trees targets for rival clans. To capture and destroy the sacred tree of an enemy was seen as an important act and was often used as a type of psychological warfare amongst clans. But in ancient Ireland and in older Ireland, the sheer abundance alone of trees did not mean that they were not valued. Trees were seen as tremendously important symbolically and functionally, to such an extent that they were legislated for in Old Irish laws. The Brehon laws included a series of laws governing tree use and included fines for damaging or cutting trees without the landowner's permission. According to the Brehon laws, trees were divided into 4 classes of importance: usefulness and symbolism. These were noble, peasant, lower divisions, and bush trees. Noble trees included oak, hazel, holly, yew, ash, pine, and apple. Peasant trees included alder, willow, hawthorn, rowan, birch, elm, and cherry. Lower division trees included blackthorn, elder, whitebeam, arbutus, aspen, and juniper. And finally, bush trees included climbing and shrub type trees such as dogrose, bramble, and gorse. The four classes were protected by law, and damage to them carried graduated fines which were owed to the owner of the land on which the trees stood. This included a type of sliding scale of penalties that included for branch removal and base felling. For example, the fine for a total removal of a tree classed as noble was the value of 2.5 milk cows, the harshest price because there was little hope of that particular tree regrowing. This underlines the importance in which trees were held by the Irish. In terms of folklore and look, trees were regarded as potent symbols often, and as sources of power even by the older Irish, though to Druids, scholars and Gaelic chieftains too. They also feature in much folklore. They have associations with health, luck, and have been regarded to have curative properties. Various types of tree were viewed as sources of magical power in folk customs and superstitions. Irish folklore features many stories in which trees played a part. Rowan trees, or mountain ash, were noted in wider Celtic mythology for their magical properties, and their red berries featured in much Irish folklore as a means of enchantment or intoxication. There are many references to magic apples too in Irish folklore. For example, a fairy woman lures the son of Conn of the 100 Battles to Tir na Nog using a magic apple, for example. Hazel timber was a significant component of building, fencing, and other products in Ireland for centuries. Hazelnuts were important to Irish diets, and in folklore, the hazelnuts were important. Those which fell from a sacred tree into the River Boyne gave the salmon of knowledge his potency. Sacred trees were most powerful in Irish folklore. There are stories of people incurring very bad luck after cutting down a sacred tree. For example, the tale of the king with the donkey's ears tells the secret of the story is given away by a speaking harp, which was made from the magical sacred tree. All yew trees were considered sacred too. They could not be cut down, and if any timber from them fell or was utilized, it had to be used to make objects that were used in sacred rituals. Many of these beliefs extended to most Irish rural people, who ensured that the belief in the magical and protective power of trees persisted up until the recent past. Some continue even to this day. To our recent ancestors, many trees were not only useful in domestic life, but were seen as potent protectors of fertility, particularly in livestock and crops. Associations with trees could also protect a house and property, along with vulnerable people like children and the sick. Although our recent ancestors were religious, the majority religion in Ireland has been Roman Catholicism. Most rural people had a parallel set of beliefs. They practiced conventional religion, but at the same time retained an otherworldly belief system that was rooted in old pagan ways, perhaps, and superstitions. Rural people sought to appease the latter in order to bring good health and luck to the household. Everyday life in rural Ireland in the past involved customs to appease fairies, for example. If one offended them, it was believed, crops might fail, livestock might not thrive, nor the health of the house. So people left offerings of milk, for example, for the fairies, and they protected liminal parts of their homes, such as windows and doors, with crosses, holy pictures, or iron objects. They built their homes away from sites associated with fairies and away from fairy paths. They also practiced folk medicine and had a belief in cures and holy places. And trees and wood played their role in this belief system. Trees marked sacred and religious sites of significance. particularly holy wells, which were thought to have restorative and curative properties. For example, the bark from an ash growing at St. Patrick's Well at Drumard, County Sligo, is said to be a cure for backache. It's estimated that there are around 3,000 holy wells in Ireland, all dedicated to saints, and the majority have a tree or bush growing alongside them. Many of these are rag trees to which a pilgrim ties a rag or other object, which it is believed will help their request, and such practices continue today. Many tree types have such associations, but in a domestic context. In Ireland, elder and holly trees were believed to deter fire, and many were planted close to houses for this reason. Willow, known in Ireland as sallies, from the Latin salix, are renowned for their practical uses. Willows grow so well in Ireland that they are regarded by many as a weed, but they were valued in the past for their ability to be coppiced and regenerate quickly. They were used in basket making and to secure thatch. People believed also that leaving willow in milk would act as a protection from fairies and prevent it from spoiling. Gorse was classed as a tree type in Brehon laws and useful to the home as occasional fuel, and its stems were useful for cleaning chimneys and scouring surfaces. It was seen as particularly potent against evil spirits who disliked the bright yellow colour of the flowers, and so it was hung over doors on May Day to discourage bad luck from entering the home. And it should be noted here that gorse is also known, depending on where you are from in Ireland, as furze or whins. In some areas, rowan or mountain ash was said to stop the dead from rising and was believed to generally protect the home and its wealth against evil. A cure for fever was said to be the hanging of holly over the door of a house. The sap of an ash tree, when burned in the fire, was considered by some to offer a cure for warts. Ivy or elder could be mixed into an ointment for burns. Decorating a May tree was a tradition in many parts of Europe too, and I'll talk more about that shortly. So we still have elements of such tree associations in Ireland to this day, yet we may not always be aware of it. People in Ireland still visit holy wells and still tie objects to rag trees. And when travelling in the countryside, one may see a lone tree, usually a hawthorn tree, in the middle of a field. These are, as I said, usually whitethorn or hawthorn and are many centuries old, and they're untouched by farmers to this day because they're seen as associated with fairies, even today. And we'll talk now a little bit more about hawthorn or whitethorn. Hawthorn flowers light up the Irish countryside throughout the months of May and June, sometimes blushed with pink. It's a common small deciduous tree, traditionally used by farmers who find its prickly thorns very useful in hedging that acts to contain livestock. So you see it an awful lot in hedgerows in Ireland. Now in May, a tradition was to bring a branch of hawthorn into the garden and decorate this May bush with eggshells and flowers. And again, this is only in some parts of the country. Into living memory, Irish children on long, hungry walks home from school would snack on the new leaves of hawthorn that appeared in spring. This is before the flowers appeared, and they were known colloquially as bread and cheese. Sometimes too in Ireland we see hawthorn at Christian holy wells, again sometimes with offerings tied. Again, these rag trees offer the hope that as the tied offering disintegrates, so too will the ailment or worry that it was placed there to represent. Yet there is a reticence too associated with hawthorn that the late poet Evan Boland called the superstitious aura of hawthorn. This may be a remnant of the ancient Irish regard for sacred trees that I've just discussed. I mentioned the association of trees earlier with the development of the Ogham alphabet, and tellingly the letter associated with hawthorn within that is hua, thought to mean fear. Often we see single hawthorn trees standing alone in fields or on old ring forts, untouched by farmers. Variously known as gentry thorn, lone bushes, or skaes, there are tens of thousands of these lone trees across Ireland. They look gnarled, weathered, and otherly throughout the winter months, without the green clothing of their leaves. These hawthorn trees that grew of their own accord, seemingly unplanted by human hands, are the most regarded with fear and superstition. These are thought of as fairy trees, associated with those unseen beings from the other world. They are believed to mark the places where the fairies would assemble and play sweet, ethereal music, ready to abduct any beautiful human being who took their fancy. Fairies could potentially destroy crops, livestock, health, or the fortune or luck of anyone they took a dislike to, or who had somehow wronged them. Even if you unwittingly wronged the fairies, they were going to come and get you, and that's what the belief was. Thus, anything associated with fairy activity in Ireland was traditionally avoided, and people used many rituals to appease them. So hawthorns are associated with fairy activity, but they're also often called May trees due to their flowering coinciding with that month. May 1st marks the major Irish festival of Baltana. Now, this is an old Irish festival, a very important one in the Irish calendar year of old that marked the beginning of summer. Before the change in the calendar in 1752, hawthorn would have been in full flower in most parts of the country in time for Baltana Eve, a night most associated with malevolent fairy activity and one where the house and its look was to be especially protected with certain rituals. The next major Irish festival associated with such heightened fairy and supernatural activity is Oíche Thána, or Halloween, marking the beginning of winter, and that's on October the 31st. Then hawthorn is in full berry, as decorated with vibrant berries, red hawberries, as they are with white flowers in May. To be in flower and full of berries alternately at these times of the year must have lent hawthorn a special air to people who held such festivals in great importance in ancient times. The school's folklore collection, or the school's collection of Irish folklore from the UCD National Folklore Collection, it's available on ducas.ie and you can search through the archives yourselves, and it's an absolutely fascinating and wonderful resource. But if you look through it, it abounds with stories of lone hawthorn growing over buried pots of gold, concurrently with tales of people coming to a very bad end if they interfere with or cause damage to these trees or utilise their fallen timber. Avoidance of these trees was the central message imparted to those child collectors of Irish folklore, and above all, bringing the flowers into their houses was completely forbidden, as these children were told it would cause very bad luck. So why was this tree singled out in Irish tradition as the one to be avoided, with its associations of fairy merriment, retribution, and bad luck? Why this one? Because if we look at its oft neighbour in the hedgerow, the blackthorn, we see many physical similarities, but it does not get such a bad press as hawthorn. Blackthorn, too, is a prickly tree used for hedge boundaries, white flowering in April. But beloved in Ireland for its useful hard timber, it's used for handles, sticks, and shillelaghs. Some suspect that the answer to this lie in the unexpectedly unflowery smell of hawthorn flowers, and this brings us to aspects that were never discussed with those innocent collectors of school's folklore. Hawthorn flowers emit a particular smell to attract mainly carrion insects such as flies to pollinate them. This is due to a chemical contained in the flowers called triethylamine that has a stale element reminiscent of gangrene or decomposing dead bodies. This smell was more familiar to people long ago. In the days before modern embalming techniques, for example, people often laid out their own dead relatives or neighbours, and sat with them during wakes, which were attended by great numbers of the local community. The decomposing smell would have been recognised as being closely associated with death. Paradoxically, triethylamine also gives the flowers a musky fragrance that some associate with the smell of sexual bodily fluids. These connotations of death and sex, largely missing from Irish folklore, perhaps sealed the fate of hawthorn being regarded as strange, inappropriate, and unwelcome inside the home and outside to be avoided. So let's move on to the 17th century. And the initial English colonisation of Ireland saw some Irish forests which were under their charge, managed in new ways. The Anglo-Normans recognised some Irish forests as royal and protected and managed some as hunting grounds and chases. The Tudor conquest of Ireland impacted the forests most significantly of all, as around this time 90% of forests in Ireland approximately were destroyed. The Tudors saw in Irish forests a timber supply that was particularly good for their shipbuilding and extracted large quantities of wood. Yet they saw the woods too as a great threat to the colonisation of Ireland. The woods represented the wildness of a country that must be tamed. The idea of a wild land with uncivilized people in need of a master to tame it is a recurrent theme in arguments by colonisers for taking possession of other countries. And indeed, Ireland was like the guinea pig of the British colonial project. It was essentially the first colony, and it is where they practiced their colonisation project, if you like. Therefore, the woods representing this needed to be cleared for farming. On a practical and somewhat symbolic level, the Irish woods also sheltered the enemies of the colonists, who prevented the full English colonisation of Ireland, so they had to be got rid of. In the late 16th century, English affairs in Ireland were at a watershed point, and the topic consumed the English more so than wars with Spain or the Netherlands. Outside of the Pale and the towns and areas consolidated by the English, the power of the Gaelic lords still held sway, and the uplands and the woodlands were the stronghold of Gaelic rebels. These were exemplified by the image of the Irish kern, a household word to the Elizabethans and a type of boogeyman to them. The term kern was what had been appropriated to denote a brutal bog-dwelling savage who was feral and animal-like. They were associated with the vast and wild Irish forests, which many of them hid out in, and they accrued the name woodkern, which was used pejoratively by the English to mean native Irish. But kern had not always had a bad image. In previous times they had been a type of foot soldier, employed by Gaelic lords when required for battle, some permanently. Hired soldiers were an important element back then in Irish military organisation. For example, gallowglasses from Scotland and horsemen were similarly used. They used heavier armour and different fighting styles. But kern were light infantrymen. Their lack of armour generally meant that they were hardy, fast and light-footed. They were considered excellent for skirmishing. They would launch surprise attacks, harry their prey, and then retreat quickly back into the woods. Now in 1521, Albrecht Dürer spotted a group of Irish kerns while waiting for a boat, I think in Belgium, and this is part of his drawing showing their dress, posture, and their weapons of great swords and poleaxes. Notice too they're barefoot, and the fact that they were barefoot allowed them to easily traverse bog and woods as a means of escape. You also see the infamous glib haircut that made Shakespeare give them the name rug-headed. And although they accrued this uncivilized image, many came from relatively privileged parts of Irish society. At the bearing of arms at that time as well was proof of status and competence, and they saw themselves as professional fighters and were known to equip themselves with the very latest weapons. Like other soldiers, wood kern or kern were accompanied by attendants, and they were firmly Gaelic and rural. And because they were hired, they were independent of feudal biases or interests. They were therefore seen as reliable and effective. And the English actually used these guys in counterinsurgency, and they hired them at times, but this didn't last. In the late 16th century, many Kern joined the rebellions. Hugh O'Neill, the Earl of Tyrone, used them to win against a powerful English side at the Battle of Yellow Ford in 1598. However, the English were increasingly seriously consolidating their conquest of Ireland, and the Kern now became known as wood kern and were associated with the woods to which they now retreated to hide. After they attacked, they would, according to John Derrick, return back to the wood from whence they came before. Their attacks on the English were marked by brutality and efficiency. When rebellion broke out in Munster in the 1580s and then Ulster in the 1590s, the Kerns came down from the woods to take part. And their continuous hiding out in the woods became symbolic of the lack of a full conquest in Ireland. And they were always seen to be there waiting to strike. And at this time, the Kern was, in the English imagination, this nightmarishly elusive, according to McGregor in 2012, this nightmarishly elusive indigenous forest fighter. We can only imagine the obsession that the Daily Mail or Sun newspaper would have had with these. If the Daily Mail or Sun newspaper would have existed back in those times, they would have been all talk about them. This is Rory Og, and this is from John Derrick's book, A Wild Kern and Defeated Rebel in the Forest with Wolves for Company. And you can see this book by Derrick casts the Irish in a less than favourable light, but it's very useful to us today to show the dress and appearance of Ireland, of Gaelic Irish in the late 16th century. And you can see there in the background the wolf, because as well as harbouring wood kern, the Irish forests harboured wolves as well, and this was not good. The English really wanted to get rid of wolves as well, because their plantations that they were trying to develop were, endangered by wolves being about. And Ireland was actually known as Wolfland at that time. Such was the profusion of wolves at that time. And you had professional English wolf hunters attracted to Ireland by generous bounties. The vast Irish forests, with their shelter of the last vestiges of Irish savagery that were obstacles to colonisation, meant that their destruction was beneficial on practical and symbolic levels to the English. Wood kerns, like wolves, were beyond rule and therefore had to be dealt with ruthlessly. The increasing deforestation, along with a great number of executions, meant that many kerns went abroad to serve foreign masters, and this is another appendage to the long tradition of Irish military serving foreign forces. By the 1650s, the wood kern threat was pretty much over, and it took until about the mid-18th century for the last wolf in Ireland to be officially eradicated. But by then, the destruction of most of the last of the ancient forests of Ireland was pretty much complete. The date 1600 AD is significant to Irish forests, as it marks the plantation of Ulster and its associated woodland clearance, but it's also because it's technically the division between ancient and recent woodland, according to Whelan, Aylan and Stout 97. Between 1600 and 1800, they state, it is estimated that around 90% of Irish forests were cut down. Throughout the 17th century, much of the felled timber was exported and used for shipbuilding, cooperage or iron smelting, and trees were not replanted in the same volumes as they had been depleted. And Whelan, Aylan and Stout leave the statistic at about 10% of woodland. Only 10% of the woodland present in 1600 AD remained at the time of the first Ordnance Survey in the early 19th century. Now, I won't lay the blame entirely at the door of the Tudors, because some Gaelic chieftains were also complicit in the clearance of woodlands, and it didn't help either that Irish timber was renowned for its superb qualities at the time throughout Europe. There's lots of evidence of timber being exported from Ireland for use in building, and there was a growing demand for Irish oak in Europe, which had a wonderful reputation amongst French and Spanish wine producers who made highly valued barrels from it. So once Irish oak had a wonderful reputation. Our landscape changed from ancient forests to a barren treeless land, not overnight, but definitely it was accelerated from these times. After the 17th century, Ireland's forest continued to be cleared for farmland. The environment was also profoundly affected by the drastic deforestation. Types of wildlife and birds disappeared. For example, woodpeckers became extinct. The climate of the country altered, affecting the land itself. There was less shelter from the westerly winds. There was a general lack of the material of timber in Ireland. It became a scarce commodity except for the rich, and local supplies were so poor that cheap timber began to be imported to Ireland, usually from Scotland. This continued for generations, and in more impoverished times throughout Irish history, even timber for coffins was unavailable or considered too expensive. Hinged coffins were used and reused at some points during the famine, for example. The post-Tudor death of the forests meant that generally the native Irish lost their traditional innate knowledge of trees and significantly the old skills in woodcraft. And there is evidence that the Irish had practiced basic forestry management techniques such as coppicing and pollarding, and they had categorized woods into certain types as well. But the lack of timber after the 17th century led to what the folklorist Kevin Danaher later described as a timber famine, which further denuded the Irish timber craft tradition. Throughout the 18th century, as the British colonial position in Ireland was completed, the estates of the landed gentry, which were planted with broad-leaved trees for shelter and habitats for game, were surrounded by high walls and were known as domains. They provided a stark contrast with the surrounding treeless land outside the estate walls. In a general era of timber and food shortage in Ireland, domains also contained gruesome man-traps to deter poachers and timber thieves. There were strict laws and harsh penalties regarding theft of timber. So this general lack of timber impacted furniture and interiors greatly, particularly in rural Ireland in terms of building and, furniture materials. Many Irish cabins contained little or no furniture, and in many rural cottages, timber furniture was at a premium. Much of the furniture was made from recycled or salvaged timber, or was upcycled from older pieces, or was even made out of straw. After the 17th century, the understanding of the symbolism and cycle of growth and rebirth in our native trees was lost to common experience, having once been an important component of spirituality and identity. Many visitors to Ireland remarked on the country's lack of trees. But there were some efforts to encourage replanting of trees in the country, most notably the scheme operated by the Royal Dublin Society throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. But there was continued woodland loss as the population grew again in the 19th century as plots were cleared for a land-hungry population. In the latter part of that century, large estates, including domains, were felled of trees and divided up for small farms. In the years after independence, most mass planting of trees was carried out by successive governments in order to halt Ireland's continued deforestation and to replace imported timber, which Ireland had become reliant upon. Most of these state forests were established on mountain land and consisted mainly of fast-growing conifers, which tended to have a degrading effect on biodiversity. Until the mid-20th century, the Irish Land Commission continued to clear woodlands from estates that had been broken up. After the 1940s, there was an emphasis on state forestry rather than private, and from the 1990s, tree planting by private individuals, usually farmers, was encouraged with the assistance of grant aid, and this has led to a great number of privately owned forests in Ireland. Today, Ireland continues to have the lowest forestry cover of all European countries, and the government aims to increase forestry. Nevertheless, there has been increasing dissent from some rural community groups that these incentives are too lucrative and that they value forestry over people. Yet Ireland's forest cover offers great benefits beyond timber production and carbon sequestration. Well-managed forests can also give employment and biodiversity, environmental protection, wildlife habitats, some rural development, amenity and recreation, and also aid tourism. Amenity woods especially have proved themselves to be increasingly popular in recent years. However, our lost traditions can also be renewed using sound methods and education, and in this way, GMIT Letterfrack is playing its part in cultivating a new generation of Irish woodcrafters and timber specialists. GMIT Letterfrack is a campus located in Connemara, and it's a campus of Galway Mayo Institute of Technology, and it specialises in furniture making, design and teacher education. The understanding of wood design and manufacture is tantamount amongst staff and students at the campus. Research projects undertaken by students in recent years have included investigation of questions in Irish forestry and wood production, as well as exploring aspects of innovation and timber production, as well as design and manufacture. Significant progress with GMIT Letterfrack's Green Campus has been made in recent years, along with many thousands of trees planted as part of the Native Woodland Scheme have all increased understanding of the importance and relevance of trees. In this way, GMIT Letterfrack is providing graduates with the knowledge and appreciation of these areas and promoting education and high standards in furniture and wood production in Ireland. If students and graduates know the value of their raw material and of the environmental impact, they are more likely to source it responsibly, use it responsibly, and produce lasting quality items from it. This now brings me to the project that inspired the book See the Wood from the Trees by myself and co-author Dermot O'Donovan. It was an act of nature in 2013 that felled hundreds of trees across the country in the winter storms. Some of the trees that fell victim to these storms were in the grounds of Áras an Uachtaráin at the Phoenix Park. A decision was made by President Michael D. Higgins to gift oak, beech and ash trees to GMIT Letterfrack. And this was the catalyst for a creative programme of education and a deepening of the relationship between the college and Áras an Uachtaráin. See the Wood from the Trees tells the story of those trees which in Letterfrack were creatively remade into beautifully designed products following a process of conversion and seasoning. It also gave an illuminating account of the significance of trees in Irish culture, the plantations at Áras an Uachtaráin, and the transformative story of Letterfrack. And here are some of the wonderful outputs. Now, the timber wasn't reserved for special pieces. Rather, the students were allowed to work with it and to see the particular process of kiln drying, for example. And students were very aware of the privilege of working on the so-called Áras timber, as well as the opportunity for working with such unique material of great character. And you can see, I'm just going to scoot through some of the pictures here of the outputs from the project, but also some of the just general student outputs from GMIT Letterfrack in recent years. And you can see here a very beautiful box was made by my head of department, Paul Leamy, for the project. I've pictured it here. It's absolutely stunning. And it was made to house very, very special editions of the book by students, and some larger works that have been made by our students in more recent times. Absolutely stunning works. and even some public seating there as well, that if you visit our college today, and under normal times perhaps you'll get a chance to when there's less restrictions about. But we have some public seating and some really beautiful works out in the front of our campus too. So to conclude the talk, Ireland had once a profusion of woodland that led to its people having a spiritual and cultural connection with trees, as well as an enduring association with them in terms of identity. However, from the 17th century, with the clearance of the woodland, Ireland became a land associated with lack of trees and barrenness, which has persisted until present times. This also resulted in us losing our ancient connection to and understanding of trees, and resulted often in a loss of woodcraft skills. But there is a new growing appreciation of woodland, trees and woodcraft, and many agencies and groups have a role to play in this renewal. With GMIT Letterfrack, for example, educating a new generation of artists, designers, makers and teachers who have all been taught an understanding of wood. So that brings me to the end of the talk, and thank you very much for listening. If you'd like more details on what we do at GMIT Letterfrack, you can go to www.gmit.ie/GMIT Letterfrack, or if you're interested in the book, it's you can find more details on that at artisanhouse.ie. So I hope that the Whose Woods These Are festival is a great success, and that hopefully we will return in person in 2021. Who knows? But thanks very much for listening.